Hello, good afternoon, all of you. I, Dr. Krishna Sinhamahapatra, welcome you all to the second lecture of the lecture series on literary criticism. So, in the last lecture, we have already begun with the idea of literary criticism, and today we are going to take it forward with respect to what we have done in the previous lecture. So, at the very beginning, we have discussed what is literary criticism, and then we went to talk about the classical origin of literary criticism. We discussed the critics related to classical literary criticism, and then we progressed ahead. So on the screen you can see my details for your reference, and you can also see the reference of my channel wherein you can connect with me after the lecture. As of now, it's a live session, so you can put down your thoughts on the chat box for any kind of discussion which you want. So, we were discussing about literary criticism. So basically, literary criticism is a way of analyzing and evaluating a piece of literature, a particular text, a writer, works, or any particular genre of literary study. And different critics have come up with their own theories, and in the context of each theorist, we are going to discuss what are their views, what they have propounded, and how they are different from others. So the very idea which we have discussed, that literary criticism, for the students who are joining the session first time, that literary criticism refers to a reasoned consideration of literary works and issues. It applies as a term to any argumentation about literature, whether or not specific works are analyzed. So we were discussing middle-age critics, and the critic we were discussing was Sir Philip Sidney. So today also we are going to take forward our lecture series with the discussion on Sir Philip Sidney. Those who were there in the previous lecture, they will remember that we initiated with the discussion, and the main idea was that Sidney was writing in response to Stephen Gossow's write-up related to the idea of the school of abuse, right? So Sidney's work is Apology for Poetry, and it is also known as the Defense of Poesy. And in many ways, it's a seminal text of literary criticism. And it not only is a defense, but also one of the most acclaimed treatises on poetics of its time. Sidney's writing of the Apology is a defense of poetry, and it was occasioned by an attack. As I was saying, it is in a response, as a response to the book The School of Abuse, which was published in 1579, written by the Puritan minister Stephen Gossow. So Sidney rejects Gossow's Protestant attack on courtly pleasure, effectively defending poetry as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. So Gossow had kind of rejected the supremacy of poetry by stating that it is nothing more than courtly pleasure. However, Sidney tried to bring back the beauty of the idea of poetry and established it as a virtuous activity for the aristocracy. So he makes charges on poetry, and the main charges which he kind of makes are: poetry is the waste of time, poetry is mother of all lies, it is a nurse of abuse, and it kind of leads on to the idea, means as a result of these points he discusses, or he makes a kind of statement. What is his statement? His statement is that Plato had rightly banished the poets from his ideal world, from his republic. Why did he banish? According to him, because of the fact that poetry is not having any kind of kind of real value, because it is nothing more than waste of time. It is just mother of lies, and it is the nurse of abuse. Sydney wrote against these charges, and Sydney states that poetry is not just waste of time, it is even not at all any kind of waste of time. Rather, it is what? It is source of knowledge and a civilizing force, right? So Gosau attacks on poetry, saying that it corrupts the people and it is waste of time. So these are the kind of charges which Gosau makes. But Sydney says that no learning is so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that nothing can both teach and amuse as poetry does. So according to him, what does poetry do? Poetry does both, teaches and amuses us, right? So in societies, poetry was the main source of education. So according to Sydney, poetry is the main source of education, so it should not be sidelined, it should not be looked down upon, and it should never be kind of banished. So he remembers ancient Greek society that respected poets, and the poets were always looked up. So he's stating very vividly and very strictly that poetry is not waste of time. Then Sydney states that poet does not lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true and can never lie. The poetic truths are ideal and universal. Therefore, poetry cannot be a mother of lies, because it is talking about certain things, certain truths which are ideal and universal. That is, it is always true, it's everywhere true. So, how can poetry be mother of lies when it is speaking about the ideal or the universal truth? So, this is the answer which he is giving. He also rejects that it is a source of abuse. To him, it is people who abuses poetry, not the vice versa. Abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. On the contrary, poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodsheds. Moreover, it brings light to knowledge. So, all these points are giving justification to the fact that poetry is not a source of abuses. Rather, poetry brings light to knowledge. Sydney views that Plato in his Republic wanted to banish the abuse of poetry, not the poets. So, this point we have to keep in mind, that he highlights that he was talking about abuse of poetry and not of the poets. He himself was not free from poeticality, which we can find in his dialogues. So, in the previous lecture, if you remember, we were discussing about Plato's dialogues, the idea of mimesis, the idea of imitation, and Sydney stating that when Plato was doing all these things and writing all these things in his Republic and in his dialogues, he was actually using a poetic language, which states that when he himself was a poet, how can he talk about banishing poets? Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior and unable to instruct the children. For Sydney, art is the imitation of nature, but it is not slavish imitation as Plato views. If you remember, we were discussing about the difference in the concept of mimesis as approached by Plato and as approached by Aristotle. If you don't remember, you can refer back to my first lecture on literary criticism, wherein we have discussed in details how the idea of mimesis is different in, or the approach towards the idea of mimesis is different in case of Plato and in case of Aristotle. And now again we are talking about mimesis or imitation, and here again Sydney is refuting the concept of slavish imitation as propounded by Plato. So he is saying, who? Sydney. Sydney is saying that it is not an imitation which is slavish imitation. That is the idea of Plato, wherein Plato stated that the writers do not have any creativity because they are just doing slavish imitation of the things which they are seeing, and the things which they are seeing in the real world are an imitation or a copy of the ideal, right? So this is what Plato was trying to say, but Sidney is saying that this act of imitation is not without any thought. It is actually rather a very thoughtful, a very creative way of imitation, and this is where the uniqueness of Sidney comes in. So rather, it is creative imitation. Nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. So the things which we see in nature, they are not very lifelike. It is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. So who turns the nature which we have outside into golden color? It is the artists who do that. He employs his creative faculty, imagination, and style of presentation. So what are the ornaments which he uses? The ornaments which he is using are his creative faculty, his imagination, his style of presentation, in order to do what? In order to decorate the raw material. Which is the raw material? The nature, the natural things which we see around us. So that is the basic raw material which is made beautiful by using of various kind of devices and tools and kind of ornaments which are in the form of creative faculty, imagination, style of presentation. For Sidney, art is what? Art is a speaking picture having spatio-temporal dimension. So art is what? It's like a speaking picture which has various spatio referring to space and temporal referring to time. So spatio-temporal dimension. So for Aristotle, human action is more important, but for Sidney, nature is more important. Now, artists are to create arts considering the level of readers. Only purpose of art is to teach and delight, like the whole tendency of Renaissance. The idea of rebirth, the idea of Renaissance. So Sidney favors poetic justice that is possible in a poet's world where good are rewarded and wicked people are punished. So this poetic justice concept you will see when you are taking up any drama, you're reading any drama and you see, or any text we see, and then we say that whether poetic justice is there or not in that particular text, in that particular work. And what do we mean by that? What we mean is that good gets rewarded and the wicked people get punished, which is referring to poetic justice. And Sidney favored the idea of poetic justice. Now, Plato's philosophy on virtue is worthless at the battlefield, but poet teaches men how to behave under all circumstances. So, according to Sidney, poets are of significance because they teach men how to behave under all circumstances. Plato was supporting whom? The philosophers. They were stating that kind of philosophers, the virtue they have, these things are important. But Sidney says that it is the poetry which is important because poets teach men how to behave under all circumstances. Moral philosophy teaches virtues through abstract examples, and history teaches virtues through concrete examples, but both are defective. Now, poetry teaches virtue. How does poetry teach virtue? By example as well as by percept, that is blend of abstract and concrete ideas. The poet creates his own world where he gives only the inspiring things, and thus poetry holds its superior position to that of what? Philosophy and history. So the debate is going on whether philosophy is more important, history is more important, or poets and poetry is more important. So according to Sidney, the poets are more important. In the poet's golden world, heroes are ideally presented and evils are corrupt. Didactic, that is again ethical effect of a poem depends on the poet's power to move. So how much a poet is able to move or emotionally touch a particular person, that is going to affect the didactic effect of the poem. It depends on the affective quality of poetry. That is how it influences, emotionally influences something. And among the different forms of poetry like lyric, elegy, satire, comedy, etc., epic is the best form, as it portrays heroic deeds and inspires heroic deeds. So you must be going through many various epic poems. Whenever we are saying epic, we are talking about some heroic deeds. We are talking about some, a particular heroic figure doing particular heroic action. So in this way, we see that Sydney defines all the charges against poetry and stands for the sake of the universal and timeless quality of poetry, making us know why the poets are universal genius. Now, keeping all these points in mind, we are going to go ahead with the discussion of the seven-part structure of Sydney's an apology or apology for poetry or the defense of poesy. So, following the seven-part structure of a classical oration, Sydney begins with an exordium or introduction. So, now this is important that you have to remember that how many part structure it is. So, it is a seven-part structure. You need to remember the title, the date when it was published, who had written it was written in against or to which idea, and what is the main idea which Sydney wants to tell us through this particular essay of his. So Sydney begins with an exordium. So this is also a important thing, that with what does he begin his write up or his essay. So he begins with an exordium or introduction. He tells an anecdote, that is a story about what? About horse riding. Noting that, like his riding instructor, Giovanni Pietro Pugliano, he will not dwell, that is, he will not stay so much on writing of poetry as the contemplation and appreciation of it. So he says that, like his riding instructor, he will not stay much on the exercise of writing of poetry as the contemplation and appreciation of it. So he will not stay much on in that particular action of writing poetry, but he will spend time on contemplation and appreciation. Since he has become a poet, he feels obliged to say something to restore the reputation of his unelected vocation. So he is saying that he is going to talk about something about poetry in order to kind of give more importance to its significance. So he begins his defense of poetry by noting that poetry was the first of the arts coming before philosophy and history. So what is the first point he gives? The first point he gives is that it is the first of the arts coming before philosophy and history. Next, indeed, many of the famous classical philosophers and historians wrote in poetry, and even those who wrote in prose, like Plato and Herodotus, wrote it poetically. So the prose was also what? It was poetical. That is, they used poetic style to come up with the philosophical allegories in the case of Plato, or to supply vivid historical details in the case of Herodotus. So he says that every writer was writing in the form or using the form of poetry, and if they were not directly writing poetry, yet their prose was poetically inclined. As a result, he is saying that everybody supported the use of poetry. Indeed, without borrowing from poetry, historians and philosophers would never have become what? Have become popular. So, in order to become popular, it is important to follow a poetic style. So, Sydney claims one can get some indication of the respect in which poets were held in the ancient world by examining the names they were given in Latin and Greek. So, we have to refer back to the names which the poets were given in the Latin and Greek. And what was the name which was given? It was Vates and Poetess. What is Vates? Vates means seer. What does seer mean? Seer means prophet. And in the classical world, poetry was considered to convey important knowledge about the future. So Sydney claims what? That it is, getting some indication of the respect in which poets were held by referring to the names which were used to refer to them, wherein Vates means seer or philosopher, and in the classical world, poetry was considered to convey important knowledge about the future. What is poetess means maker, and this title refers or reflects on the fact that poets, like God, could create new and more perfect realities using their imagination. So, by using their imagination, what was happening? By using their imagination, poets could create new realities using their imagination. So the poets were known as what? Vates, very Vates referring to seers and prophets, talking about the fact that they were conveying important knowledge about the future, and poets meaning maker, wherein that God created new and more perfect realities using their imagination. So if God is creating realities around us, the poets also create realities using their imagination and creating a world around us. Sydney then moves to the proposition that offers or where offers a definition of poetry as an art of imitation that teaches its audience through delight or pleasure. So, what does he talk about? A proposition where he offers a definition of poetry as an art of imitation that teaches its audience through delight and pleasure. So, two things, delight and pleasure, or we can say delight or pleasure. Anyways, it is about happiness, it is about pleasure, it is about feeling good, it is about feeling positive. So, the idea, which if we bring this together, is that it was talking about something good, something positive. So, offers a definition of poetry as an art of imitation that teaches its audience through any kind of positive emotion. So, it is its ability to embody ideas in compelling images. So, poetry becomes like a picture. So, all of you, if you see a beautiful picture, you see that you feel good. You see a positive vibe comes in our mind. So here also he is saying that poetry is just like a speaking picture. So it's not just a picture, but it is also speaking to you. It is talking to you through the language which is used. Sydney then specifies that the kind of poetry he is interested in is not religious or philosophical, but rather that which is written by right poets. So the kind of poetry which he is interested in is not what? Is not religious or philosophical. So he is not interested in religious or philosophical poetry, but rather which is written by what? By right poets. This ideal form of poetry is not limited in its subject matter by what exists in nature, but instead creates perfect examples of virtue that, while maybe not real, is well suited to teaching readers about what it means to be good. So, could you understand this? What is it mainly trying to say? That they instead create perfect examples of virtue that, while may not be real, is well suited to teaching readers about what it means to be good. So poetry provides us with examples which tell us how things should actually be like. So poetry is more effective teacher of virtue than history or philosophy, because instead of being limited to the realm of abstract ideas like philosophy, or to the realm of what has actually happened like history, poetry can present perfect examples of virtue, that is, the good things, in a way best suited to instruct its readers. So, here, he is talking about the fact that history and philosophy have their own limitations. What kind of limitations? The limitation of philosophy is that it is tied down to the realm of abstract ideas. So the philosophers do what? They give us some ideas, some philosophies which are about certain ideas. And what do historians do? They give us kind of real facts which have actually happened. So they cannot deviate. A historian cannot deviate from the facts. However, a poet has power in his hand, and the power is that he can present perfect examples of virtue, which is best suited to instruct its readers. So, the poet can embody the philosopher's wordish descriptions of virtue in compelling characters or stories, which are more pleasurable to read and easier to understand and remember, like Aesop's fables. So, all of you must have read Aesop's fables, right? So, the poet can embody the philosopher's wordish descriptions of virtue. So there the writer can take up a philosophy. So you will see that whenever there are some fables or you will see the children's storybooks, at the end there is always this moral of the story. So the moral of the story is, so that moral of the story is basically, the wordish description of virtue, which he is referring to over here. So the poet can embody the philosopher's wordish descriptions of virtue, how in compelling characters or stories which are more pleasurable to read and easier to understand and remember, like Aesop's fable. So through the use of poetry or prose, what happens, you can actually give life to the philosophy and make it more lifelike, more pleasurable to read, and easier to understand and also remember. So, the poet should therefore be considered the right popular philosopher, since with perfect and pleasurable examples of virtue, like Aeneas from Virgil's Aeneid, poetry can move readers to act virtuously. So you will see that whenever we are reading a story, for example, if I talk about your portion, for example, in compulsory English, you might have read one of the texts, which is good manners, or in additional English, you might have read that good manners, or you might have, all of you must be reading Where the Mind is Without Fear by Rabindranath Tagore. So when you are reading that poem, what is happening is that you are actually learning certain good values which Tagore is trying to communicate to you, where the mind is without fear, where the head is held high, where knowledge is free. So, all these concepts and topics and ideas, which are the ideas of a philosopher, are given to you in a poetical form, then you don't get bored. When you are reading a poetry, when you are reading an interesting prose, you don't get bored by the fact that there is language which is used, there is certain amount of imagination which is used, there are different images which are used to actually make that idea very, very, kind of bring that idea very much near to you. And what happens is that you kind of, you are influenced by that. So you're influenced, you realize what real freedom is when you are reading Where the Mind is Without Fear. If I would have asked you to attend a philosophy class and you were in a philosophy class, some of you would listen to the teacher and be influenced, but others might not have that capacity of listening for a long time. So when you are in a poetry class, what happens? You enjoy that process. And through that process, you learn to act virtuously. So, reading poetry about virtue, Sydney writes, is like taking a medicine of cherries. So, you will see that kids, when, if you have a child at home, somebody's comes a child at your home, your brother, sister, or anybody's child is there at home, if you see their medicines, they always have some flavor in them. Strawberry, thank you so much. Good afternoon, Gautam. So, you will see that it's strawberry or cherry flavored, or there has to be some flavor in it. Otherwise, a child will not take that up, right? So, that child will always say that, no, I don't want it. So, Sydney is also identifying with this fact and stating that reading poetry gives you a pathway to virtue, and that pathway is in the form of, a kind of a very tasty, a very, thing which you enjoy, which you kind of relish. So, it is just like taking medicine of cherries. Sidney writes an apology of poetry or for poetry in the form of judicial oration for the defense. And thus, it is like a trial in structure. So, what is the structure? The structure is just like a trial. So, what is the form? The form is the form of a judicial oration. And we also discussed that how many paths are there, how there are 7 paths, and he starts with an introduction. So, crucial to his defense is the descriptive discourse and the idea that poetry creates separate reality. So, what does poetry do? Poetry creates a separate reality, and it is in the form of the discourse wherein language is used in order to create that reality. So, Sydney employs forensic rhetoric as a tool to make the argument that poetry not only conveys a separate reality, but that it has a long just a minute. Yes. So, Sydney employs forensic rhetoric as a tool to make the argument that poetry not only conveys a separate reality, but that it has a long and venerable history and it does not lie. So we have to remember that this whole treatise, this whole write up, this whole work is in reaction. I hope it's audible now. Yes. So the whole idea is as a reaction to Gosau's work, right? So, is it audible now? So, it is defensible in its own right as a means to move readers to virtuous action. So, you will see that Sydney employs what he employs this whole structure to state that any kind of poetry, it actually doesn't lie. So it actually moves the readers to what kind of action? To virtuous action. What do we mean by virtuous action? By virtuous action, we mean the action which moves us to good or any kind of virtuous deed. So, through this, we kind of discussed what Sydney was trying to do, what kind of form he had used, what kind of argument which he had given, and what kind of structure was there in his way of, writing. And at the end, we find that he went against certain ideas of Plato, if not all, and he stated that a poet does imitation, but that imitation is in the form of what? Is in the form of creating something new, giving life to what is created. And if mundane and normal things are there around us in nature, a poet turns it into golden through his golden touch, through his creation of a reality which is a new version of reality. And that is where the beauty of a poet lies, and that is what makes poetry really interesting and the poets worthy of emulation, and the poets their respect and their position should be secured. And he goes against all the points which were referred to in order to kind of put down poetry and state poetry as something which is not that important. Now, this brings us to the next segment of our discussion, the Enlightenment age critics. First Enlightenment age critic whom we are going to deal with is John Dryden. So yesterday, rather the first lecture which we had kind of 3 or 4 days back, you must have seen that we have divided our lecture series on literary criticism in different ages, and we are going to take up the important writers and important critics of those ages. So we are now moving on to the new phase. So, John Dryden is rightly considered as the father of English criticism. Who is the father of English criticism? John Dryden. He was the first to teach the English people to determine the merit of composition upon principles. So, the merit of composition is talking about the merit of creating something, composing something like a poem, like a prose. So, determine the merit of composition upon principles, so based on principles. Except an essay of dramatic poesy, Dryden wrote no formal treatise on criticism. So, other than this, he didn't write any other formal treatise on criticism. His critical views are found mostly in the prefaces of his poetical works or those to others. So usually some of the works, whenever, or rather most of the works, when they are published, you have got some section of preface, or people, if somebody wants to introduce it, so if they want to say something, you have it in those works. But other than that, the formal treatise which he has written as a critic, that is an essay of dramatic poesy. So you need to know about this. Dryden upholds Aristotle's definition of poetry as a process of imitation. So if you remember, when we were discussing Aristotle, we said that Aristotle is also talking about imitation, but what Aristotle says, and he kind of goes against Plato in the fact that a poet is also imitating, but his object of imitation is not as mundane and simple like a bed. He is imitating what? He is imitating a virtue, a value, or some kind of good action to reach out to more people through his artistic creation. So, he is upholding, Dryden is also upholding the idea of Aristotle. So, he is stating that poetry imitates what? Facts, past or present. Then what does it imitate? It imitates popular beliefs, superstitions, and things in their ideal form. So what does it imitate? It imitates facts, past or present, popular beliefs, superstitions, and things in which form? In their ideal form. So this is what brings in importance to the idea of poetry. So Dryden defends Shakespeare's use of the supernatural founded on popular beliefs. So he defends Shakespeare's use of supernatural because he's stating that it is founded on popular beliefs. So he's saying that poetry, work of literature, is actually imitating what? Facts, past or present, popular beliefs, superstitions, and things in their ideal form. And as a result, he is defending Shakespeare. For it is still an imitation, though, of other men's fancies. So it is an imitation. Imitation of what? Of other men's or other men fancies. So somebody else's fancy is imitated, right? According to him, poetry and painting are not only true imitations of nature, but of the best nature, as much greater criticism. So poetry and painting are not only true imitations of nature, but of the best nature, a much greater criticism. So he is stating that both poetry and painting are of high kind of status, because whenever they are doing imitation, they bring about the best of nature, and their way of criticism is the best. Then the function of poetry. So the final end of poetry, according to Dryden, is delight and transport rather than instruction. So the virtue which he is talking about, the final end of poetry, is what is delight. That is again happiness. You get the joy which you get out of reading poetry, and transport in the sense it actually transports you to a different place. That is your imaginary transport, or the imaginary travel which happens in your mind, the way you are kind of transported to a new world through reading. So he is saying that the final end of poetry is to delight and transport rather than what? Rather than instruct. So instruction makes it what? It becomes a kind of a more serious kind of discussion wherein you have to listen to something. But Dryden is saying that poetry is superior to that. It is something which brings in delight, and it actually transports you to a completely whole new world, a new reality. Right? So this is how poetry is important. Next, to realize it, it does not merely imitate life but offers its own of it. That is a beautiful resemblance of the whole. So we see that the imitation thing is still there, but the way of representing it is different. So here we are talking about the fact that it is a beautiful resemblance of the whole. So the act of writing, the act of creating something has resemblance, but it's a beautiful resemblance of the whole, of the actual facts which are there around us. The poet is neither a teacher nor a bare imitator, a photographer, but a creator. So he's saying that a teacher or a bare imitator is, he's not like a photographer who is capturing the reality. So all of us are photographers in today's age, right? We are busy taking our photographs, our selfies, and posting them in the social media. It keeps us busy all day, right? We love doing it. But when we are just clicking a photograph, it's the art of clicking the photograph. I agree, because somebody will click very good photographs, somebody will not click as good as the other. However, we are just doing what? We are clicking the photograph. So we are doing what? We are just creating an image of the thing which is there before us. But what does Dryden talk about? He's stating that a poet is not just like a photographer or an imitator. Rather, he is something more. And when we are saying something more, what is he? He is a creator. Creator means he's bringing in a new life, he's giving life. So he is one who, with life or nature as his raw material, produces. What does he produce? Produces a new thing. So this word produce is important, because producing talks about creation of something new. And producing what? Producing a new thing altogether, resembling the original in its basis, but different from it in the superstructure. A work of art rather than a copy. So this is what you have to understand, that what you need to understand over here is that you are creating a work, and that work which you have created is something which is beautiful, a work of art which is kind of a new life is given, and it is not just a copy, but something new, something which is beautiful, which makes the poetry something sublime, something delightful, something which transports us to a new world. Now he discusses about the form of poetry. So Dryden's essay of dramatic poesy is written as a debate on drama conducted by four speakers. So you have to remember the kind of reference to its structure, its form, who are there in this piece. So there are four speakers in this. Who are they? Eugenius, Critias, Lycidius, and Neander. So this essay of dramatic poesy is written as a debate, and debate is on drama. So you can see dramatic poesy is there in the title. Dramatic poesy is referring to what? Is referring to the fact that it is something which is related to drama. And the four speakers are Eugenius, Critias, Lycidius, and Neander. These personae have conventionally been identified with four of Dryden's contemporaries. Eugenius meaning well-born, maybe Charles Sackville, who was Lord Buckhurst, a patron of Dryden and a poet himself. Critias, Greek for judge or critic, perhaps represents Sir Robert Howard, Dryden's brother-in-law. Lycidius refers to Sir Charles Sedley, and Neander is Dryden himself. So this is how the characters, the four speakers in Dryden's essay of dramatic poesy is identified. Okay? Now, what is the idea of dramatic poetry? So drama claimed most of Dryden's attention. On the introduction of unpalatable or incredible senses such as battles and deaths on the stage, he says that death can never be imitated to a just height and hence it should be avoided. What should be avoided? According to him, death should be avoided. Why? Because he is saying that it can never be possible to imitate death in the real sense of the term. And as a result, it is best that we avoid representation of death. He sees nothing wrong in other physical action like battles, duels, and the like. Dryden does not subscribe to the accepted interpretation of the three unities, that the plot should be single, the time of action 24 hours, and the place the same everywhere, where scene leads to scene in the unbroken chain. So he does not subscribe to the idea of what? The idea of three unities: unity of plot, unity of time, and unity of place. Unity of action. So the action, then plot, and then the place. So he is saying that it is not possible to have or maintain these three unities perfectly. He favors instead the weaving of subplot into the main plot. He feels that the plot time can be increased a little more to allow for greater maturity of the plot. So he is saying that time limit can be increased in order to allow greater maturity of the plot. In the same way, the unity of place cannot be maintained, as the time taken by the events of the play determines the location of the scene, and the unity of place can be waived. So, he's saying that the unity of place cannot be maintained, as the time taken by the events of the play determine the location of the scene, and the unity of place can thus be excused. Now, Dryden considers the units of time and place too rigorous, and they leave little scope for the development of plot and character. So what does he consider? He considers the units of time and place too rigorous, and that they leave little scope for the development of plot and character. And that is the reason why he is not subscribing to the idea of three unities. And the three unities are referring to the unities of the time, place, and action. Now he talks about specifically tragedy. So Dryden's definition of tragedy is the same as Aristotle's. That is an imitation of one entire great and probable action, not told but represented, which by moving in us fear and pity is conducive to the purging of those two emotions in our minds. So the two emotions, fear and pity, and the concept of catharsis, if you remember, we discussed when we were doing Aristotle, right? So here also he is stating that, the idea of moving in us the two emotions of fear and pity is important. So, an imitation of one entire great and probable action, not told but represented, which by moving in us fear and pity is conducive to the purging of those two emotions in our minds. So, creation of a cathartic feeling. Dryden merely follows Aristotle and Horace in his remarks on the tragic hero and other characters in tragedy. So he follows Aristotle and Horace in the remarks on the tragic hero and the characters in tragedy. Dryden has no use for the group of characters called chorus in the Greek tragedy. So he has no use, according to him, related to group of characters called chorus in Greek tragedy. So usually we know that there is chorus. When we are reading a drama, a play, there is a chorus who gives us certain informations about the setting, about what is going on in that particular play, in that drama. But he is not giving any space for the concept of chorus. Now we come to the discussion of comedy. So Dryden has not much of his own to say on comedy. Again, he follows Aristotle and he calls it as a representation of human life in inferior persons and low subjects. So this is how he talks about comedy. To the question whether comedy delights or instructs, Dryden says that the first end of comedy is delight and instruction only the second. So what is the first idea of comedy? The first job of comedy is to bring about what? Delight. And instruction is only the second option, the second idea. The persons in comedy are of lower quality. The action is little, and the faults and vices are but the sallies of youth and frailties of human nature. They are not premeditated crimes. So, how are the people in the comedy? They are of lower quality. The action which they are doing is little, and the faults and vices are but the sallies and faults and of youth and frailties of human nature, and they are not premeditated crimes. Dryden wanted English comedy to be more refined than it was. So, what quality he wanted it to have? He wanted it to be refined. According to him, Ben Jonson had only specialized in humor, and what it lacked was wit. So he took the example of one of the writers. If you remember, when we started talking about literary criticism, we discussed that it can be about a particular genre. That is, it can be about poetry, it can be about prose, it can be about any specific kind of the genre. For example, comedy and tragedy, which are parts of drama, right? Similarly, when we are talking about criticism, it can be also about what? About the writers, about dramatists, about poets. So here, he is talking about one of them, that is Ben Jonson. And he's stating that according to him, Ben Jonson had only specialized in what? In humor. And what it lacked was wit. When we are seeing witty dialogue, some kind of clever uh, interpretation of things comes in. So he's saying that humor was there, but wit was not there. As repartee is one of the chiefest graces of comedy, the greatest pleasure of audience is a chance exchange of wit kept up on both sides and swiftly managed. So he supports wit in comedy, not just humor. So Beaumont and Fletcher were adept in the art. So according to him, it's not Ben Jonson, but it was Beaumont and Fletcher who were the best in this art. So what Dryden wanted in comedy was refined laughter rather than the coarse one, arising out of display of humors or eccentric traits in individuals. So he is, you will see that nowadays various comedy shows are there. And you as an individual might not connect with all of them. Why so? Because somewhere you will see that the comedy is very, kind of not up to your intellectual mark. As a result, though it's a comedy show, you do not get connected with that. However, in some other comedy shows, somewhere you will see that there is more exchange of witty dialogues and the situation based humor, which makes you more engaged with that particular show. So this is what, exactly what Dryden is trying to say, that when we are, according to him, Ben Jonson is more specialized in humor, but he wants a writer to talk about wit. And Beaumont and Fletcher, he is stating, were more adept or more capable of doing it. So while in a comedy of humors, the spectators laughed at the humorous character, in a comedy of wit or comedy of manners as it grew, they laughed with the witty one. So the fact that the spectators, if they laughed at the humorous character in case of comedy of humors, in a comedy of wit or comedy of manners as it grew into, they laughed with the witty one. Next comes the epic. So Dryden is with the French critics in considering the epic superior to tragedy. So previously also, as we were reading the other thinkers and the critics, we were seeing that epic is always given more importance. So yes, I see quite a few of you there. Thank you for joining in. Please stay there. I think Gautam was already there. Chandramani is there. Avinash is there. Thank you for your comments and thank you for being there. So uh, again, we say that epic has always been important, and it is considered superior to the tragedy by the French critics, and also Dryden is supporting this view. He asks, what virtue is there in tragedy which is not contained in epic poems? So he is saying that everything which is there in tragedy is also considered or is a part in an epic poem. He stresses that the epic is certainly the greatest work of human nature. So what does he state? He states that epic is certainly the greatest work of human nature. So what is the greatest work of human nature? The greatest work of human nature is epic. So Aristotle had preferred the tragedy to the epic. Who had preferred? Aristotle. But who has not preferred? We see the French critics and we see Dryden. Now, regarding the visual appeal of the tragedy, Dryden uses 3 points. That it is the actor's work as much as the poet's. And so the poet alone cannot deserve credit for it. And that the stage is handicapped to show So regarding the visual appeal of the tragedy, Dryden urges what? He urges 3 points. What are the 3 points? That it is the actor's work as much as the poet's. So the poet alone cannot deserve credit for it. that the stage is handicapped to show many things, like big armies, for instance, in words, that while we have leisure to digest what we read in the epic, we miss many beauties of a play in the performance. So, this is regarding the visual appeal of the tragedy, that how it is visually appealing. So, he urges three points, that is the actor's work as much as the poet's, and so the poet alone cannot deserve credit for it. That the stage is handicapped to show many big things, like big armies, for instance, in words, and that while we have leisure to digest what we read in the epic, we miss many beauties of a play in the performance. Dryden disagrees with Aristotle again in insisting on a moral in the epic. So he's insisting on what? He's insisting on a moral, the need of moral in the epic. The next form is satire, and in the first instance, the satire must have unity of design, confining itself for that purpose to one subject or principally one. In other words, the satirist should choose one vice or folly for his target, as the epic poet chooses one character for his special praise and make all others subservient to it, as the epic poet does the other characters. So, what is a satirist doing? The satirist chooses one vice or folly for his target. What does he choose? One vice or folly. So one thing, one particular, a character of a character's vice or folly is chosen by a satirist, as the epic poet chooses a character for his special praise and make all others subservient to it. So that one vice which is chosen by the satirist, that becomes important. Just the way in case of epic, you see that there is one particular main character, right, which is chosen, and other characters become unimportant with reference to that. In the same way, he should extol someone's precept of moral virtue. For the manner of the satire, Dryden would prefer fine raillery. Now, according to Dryden, a critic has to understand that a writer writes to his own age and people, of which he himself is a product. Now, if you remember literary theory, in literary theory, we were talking about the one of the factors of your theory being reference to the social context. So here Dryden is saying that a writer is not just an individual, but he is writing to his own age and to his own people, which he himself is a product of. He advocates a close study of the ancient models, not to imitate them blindly, as a thoroughgoing neoclassicist would do, but to recapture their magic, to treat them as a torch to enlighten our own passage. So, what are they trying to say? That they are trying to say that you are actually doing what? You are actually kind of, you're advocating a close study of the ancient models. And why are you doing it? Not to imitate them blindly, but to do what? But to recapture their magic, to treat them as a torch to enlighten our own passage. So, just in order to enlighten our own passage, we need a light, right? In the night, if you don't have light, then what do you need? You switch on your mobile torch to have some light, right? So, similarly, he is advocating or stating that close study of the ancient models not only, it doesn't just lead us to imitate that, but what does it do? It helps us to recapture their magic and treat them as a torch to enlighten our own passage. So, any work, as I was saying, you read a very good poem and you get inspired by that. And that is what, kind of gives you, or that is the takeaway from that particular piece of literature. In the spirit of classics, that matters more than their rules. Yet these rules are not without their value, for without rules there can be no art. So, according to Dryden, without value there cannot be any art. Besides invention, the disposition of a work, there are two other parts of a work, that is the design and expression. So these are the two other parts of a work, design or arrangement and expression. Dryden mentions the appropriate rules laid down by Aristotle. But it is not the observance of rules that makes a work great, but its capacity to delight and transport. If you remember, we started with this discussion wherein we kind of we're asking and kind of understanding how the main purpose is to delight and transport. So it is not the business of criticism to detect petty faults, but to discover those great beauties that make it immortal. So, what is the main duty? The main duty, it is not the business of criticism to detect the petty faults, small faults, but to discover those great beauties that make it immortal. Next, we are discussing so Dryden's criticism is partly, you can understand when we are saying value, then value is talking about the importance of his criticism. So Dryden's criticism is partly a restatement of the precepts of Aristotle, partly a plea for French neoclassicism, and partly a deviation from both under the influence of Longinus and Saint Evremond. From Aristotle, he learned, what did he learn? He learned respect for rules. So French neoclassicism taught him to prefer the epic to tragedy. So these are the influences which you need to take a note of. To insist on moral in it and many of the things. And to Longinus and Saint Evremond, he owed a respect for his own judgment. So Dryden is a liberal classicist who would adjust the rules of the ancients to the genius of the age to which a poet, writes. Now, what do we understand from here is that he is actually being influenced by different writers and different, workers before him, the people who have contributed before him, and he has kind of utilized them and used them as per his age. So, we will be concluding this particular part by stating that John Dryden's An Essay on Dramatic Poesy presents a brief discussion on neoclassical theory of literature, and he defends the classical drama, saying that it is an imitation of life and reflects human nature clearly. So, what is classical drama according to him? It is an imitation of life and he reflects human nature clearly. An essay on dramatic poesy is written or in the form of a dialogue, as we saw. Who were the gentlemen we were discussing? Eugenius, Critus, Lacidius, and Neander. And Neander speaks for Dryden himself, which we have already discussed, that he is playing that particular character. Eugenius favors modern English dramatists by attacking the classical playwrights who did not themselves always observe unity of place, but Critus defends the ancients and points out that they invited the principles of dramatic art paved by Aristotle and Horace. Critus opposes what rhyme in plays and argues that though the moderns excel in sciences, the ancient age was true age of poetry, And Lycidius defends French playwrights and attacks the English tendency to mix genres. Next writer or the next critic we are going to take up is Alexander Pope in the next lecture. So, with this, we will be concluding today's lecture. We discussed about the critics and tried to see what kind of comparison and kind of uh, ideas which they have shared regarding the different genres of literature. And this discussion we are going to carry forward in the next lecture. So, till then, thank you for joining in. See you all in the next lecture. So, I can see a few of you have written about certain points regarding notes. So, I think that will be taken up by the coordinator of the session. As of this particular topic, if you have any topics, you can ask that in the chat box. If not, you can get in touch with me after the lecture. So, thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. Have a good day. See you in the next session.